How do you write a melody? Well, the first lesson, we're going to set some limitations on what you can write. And this may seem to be a little too restrictive at first, but the goal of this lesson is to show you the amount of variety you can get with just a few notes and a few chords. But first, let me help my case. Here's a quote from Igor Stravinsky, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. He said, "My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees one's self of the chains that shackle the spirit." So for this first lesson, we are going to limit ourselves to using the major scale. Now that's a given. But we are going to also limit which notes we can pick at any one time. The way we limit this is by using only chord tones in our melody. And these chord tones will be from the underlying harmonies that you will be using to compose. But don't worry, that too will be a restriction, as I'm going to give you a few chord progressions to compose to. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how these chord progressions work, as that will be covered in harmony lessons later on. Just go ahead and accept these chord progressions, and then we'll move on from there. Your goal here is to create as many melodies as possible within these limitations. So let's illustrate. Let's say that you have some given chords and you want to create a melody that only uses chord tones. Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to know the chord tones that you can use. In this case, we have a C, E, and G for the first chord, and we have a G, B, and D for the second chord, and then for the last chord we have C, E, G again. Now let me point out something real quick. The second chord is actually an inversion. The basic triad is G, B, D. But in order to have smooth voice leading, I changed it to its first inversion, which is B, D, G. Now this means that the C on the bottom of the first chord now only needs to move by 1/2 step into the second chord, and it gives it a much smoother feel. And we'll talk a little bit more about inversions and voice leading in the first lesson on harmony. So once we establish the notes we can use, we then decide which note to start on. Most tonal music begins on the tonic chord, or the first chord in a scale, so starting your melody on scale degree 1, also called tonic, will give it a very stable feeling. So there's the chord. If you were to start on scale degree 5, it's also a very stable sound. Starting on 3, on the other hand, gives it a little bit more instability and makes the music want to drive. Nonetheless, you can start on any of those notes, so we'll just go ahead and choose C. From here, we can then move on to the next chord. Now we have a G chord, also known as the dominant chord, and within the dominant chord we have G, B, and D, so we can select any one of those notes. Now I don't want the melody to move too much, so I'm going to go ahead and choose a D, which is only 1 step away from the C. So now we've got something like this. And then finally we move back to the C chord, and we can choose any of those original notes, and I'm just going to go ahead and choose C because it's also very close. It makes a very smooth little melody. And this is basically it. But that's not the end. We can create many different kinds of melody when we start to change the rhythm. If I were to use some quarter notes and eighth notes, I could create something much more interesting, just with the chord tones. Here's an example of what I've done. Now, it's not, going to be breaking any traditions or, revolutionize the world, but it's not a bad little melody, especially if this is the first thing you've composed. And chord tone melodies, well, they're very common in music. For instance, here's an example from Mendelssohn's Octet in E-flat major. Okay, so using the chord progressions on exercise number 1, we're going to go ahead and create an entire chord tone melody from scratch. Now try and get inventive, especially with the rhythm on these, kind of like I did with my second example, and go with your gut instinct. If you think it sounds good, I think you should keep it. So let me go ahead and play through these real quick so you can hear what they sound like. Both of them are relatively simple chord progressions, and the key is to just go through each chord and to look at the specific chord tones that are there and use those for your melodies. So here's the first one. Real simple. It uses kind of the main chords that are considered, real functional chords in harmony. You've got 1, 5, back to 1, then you go up to 2, then to 5, and then to 1. The next one is a little bit smoother in the bass line. It sounds like this. And here we do have some inversions, so you just have to look out for those. Just realize whether it's an inversion or not, it's got the same chord. So you got 1, you've got 5, 6, with that B in the bass. You've got 4, 6, A in the bass. And you've got a 1, 6, then a 4, a 5, and then back to 1.